we're underway with Newscast 7 days, and that's the sort of productivity that Elon Musk would be pleased with us. This is a 7-day-a-week operation.
It's not enough, Paddy.
He's written to all federal employees asking them to send 5 bullet points, copied to their boss. What have you done?
What have you done for me lately? Some people might say.
Yeah. Would you pass the test? I think you would.
Oh, what have I done?
Well, in the nicest possible way.
5 things?
Well, not 5.
Oh, not 5.
Yeah, but
Okay, I made lots and lots of phone calls on Thursday and Friday, and I wrote a piece for the front page of the website yesterday.
And you hosted a TV show this morning.
I did a TV show this morning. We did a podcast yesterday. So that's 3.
Yeah, that'll do.
Is that enough?
So we'll talk a little bit about the White House, and we're lucky to have Joe Pike with us this Sunday when we get underway with Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Laura in the studio.
It's Paddy in the studio.
And it's Joe Pike in the studio.
Hello again, Joe Pike. How very nice to have us with you.
Thanks for inviting me.
How very nice to have us with you, did you say?
Did I say that?
You did. You're telling how lucky you are, Joe, to be appearing on this newscast.
That's with all thy worldly goods I me endow.
So, Joe, we know you as a political expert. You're a political boffin today. What kind of period are we in? Is this where one of the biggest prime ministerial visits to the US in decades?
I think it probably is. The jeopardy is massive. I mean, there's always jeopardy in these sorts of visits, but just the unpredictability of the occupant of the Oval Office, I think, has changed things. And also the fact that Keir Starmer is arriving in a Washington that has had a month of chaos. Bless you, a month of chaos. You spoke about Elon Musk's email over the weekend. On Friday night, we had this. What would you call it? Sort of massacre in the Pentagon of senior officials, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And we've also had Donald Trump at CPAC making a speech really about political retribution. So the Prime Minister will arrive in a city that's got a lot of other things going on aside from UK PM.
And there is always that imbalance, isn't there, for the UK? It's a huge deal to go to the White House. Like, it's the reddest of red letter days, and journalists, including people like myself, get kind of frothy with excitement about the press pack going to Washington and all of those kinds of things. But there is always this kind of, it's another diary item for an American president, and the US has special relationships with lots and lots and lots and lots of countries. However, the context this time, right, is that Starmer on Thursday, Macron on Monday will be going with what will be a pretty similar message. Take your time in Ukraine. Don't rush into a bad peace deal. And it's interesting today, you've seen the Prime Minister and Secretaries of State sort of fan out across the written press and also in broadcast media saying there has to be a voice for Ukraine. There mustn't be a rush to a deal that could have consequences, essentially telling Trump to slow down, but of course still not being explicit on what the UK is willing to offer up itself.
Yes. So in our job of trying to provide a summary of the Sunday journalism on the television, on the radio and in the papers and online, the Prime Minister's written a piece in The Sun on Sunday saying you've got to put Ukraine at the centre of a peace deal. Then one of the other papers says it's likely they will dangle a state visit. We've discussed this, so this will be his second state visit to the UK. Then also David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, is out with a sanctions plan. Have you spotted that, Joe?
I don't know in detail, Paddy.
Does anyone know it in detail?
Well, I think another huge package of sanctions against Russia, and I think it'll all be formalised tomorrow. So you can see the UK sort of saying, we're going to support Ukraine, we're still going to keep hammering Russia, there's still going to be military support for Ukraine. But on this big question of whether they're going to pony up for more defence spending, there's a huge guessing game still going on. And this morning, the Secretary of State for Education, Bridget Phillipson, was still, playing that game about when the government will, in due course, set out how it will reach its 2.5% target. But there's a bit of a sense in Westminster that Keir Starmer is almost sort of one of the last people not to be saying you're going to have to do a lot more than that on defence, Joe. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting. The Sunday Times had this line that Lord Mandelson, Peter Mandelson, the new ambassador in DC, has been counselling Keir Starmer to get to 2.5% by 2030. I've spoken to a couple of sources in government who say that's correct, but Lord Mandelson is just one of a number of people, including figures in the MOD, who want significant spending by 2030. And there are two reasons why that is very important. These sorts of people argue for the UK and for Keir Starmer. One, you don't even get through the door with Donald Trump unless you show a very clear timetable of ramping up spending, even though he wants far more than 2.5%, let's be honest. And the second point is there's this strategic defence review we've been hearing about endlessly in recent months, written by Lord Robertson, the former NATO Secretary-General and Labour Defence Secretary. And how can you put together a review and really understand where the UK should be spending money in defence in this sort of new, far more drone-based, AI-based defence space if you don't know how much money you've got? Even though, of course, the UK has a pretty bad record in defence procurement, and billions has been wasted in previous projects.
And also, I think in this, the Labour government is still hung up on the idea of when they're going to meet their existing commitment. But their existing commitment of 2.5 was made in a completely different world before Donald Trump stood up and sort of upended the assumption of the last many decades that America would always be around as this sort of, Europe's bodyguard ready to step in and support.
Let's have a listen to what Bridget Phillipson said on the TV.
2.5% is ambitious, and the last time that was achieved, of course, was under a Labour government. It is an ambitious commitment, a commitment that we made in our manifesto. We are determined to deliver, and we will set out that pathway towards it. But you will forgive me, I'm not in a position on your programme this morning to give you that information, but others will confirm what that timetable looks like, the pathway towards it. And we are already investing more in defence, both here and also the additional £3 billion a year we are putting towards defence spending.
It was only a few months ago we had a UK general election and we were not talking about defence spending as a number one issue. The Conservatives were going to be thrown out after 14 years and 75,000 prime ministers they gave us. And the public were talking about a totally different range of subjects.
They were, but defence spending has been on the radar for a long time.
Yes.
It has definitely in recent months been rising up very quickly. And yes, things have changed dramatically in the last 10 days. And we talked about that a lot on yesterday's newscast, which is still available for your ears wherever you get your audio products. But the government can't make a case that somehow they've been blindsided.
No.
And they cannot have been taken by surprise by the fact that defence spending suddenly seems more urgent, not least because the Chief of the Defence Staff in November made absolutely clear that he thinks that more money needs to be spent. And also that politicians like Keir Starmer himself have sat for months saying things like, we're in a new era of danger, the threats are increasing. Do you remember Grant Shapps, the former Defence Secretary, said we were in a pre-war world?
He did.
So this hasn't just come from a clear blue sky in the last 10 days.
What it shows me, I think back to my life as a student in Aberdeen at the end of the Cold War, that's how long ago it was.
Which one?
Is that who can forget the Prussian War of 18? It shows quite how much we have been dominated by the United States of America. So
peace.
And as a student, we used to have an argument: are we the poodle of America? Now, this war in Ukraine has been going on for 3 years, and this argument about defence spending has been triggered by the President of the United States. That's what's actually happened. Newscasters are having their ears bent about this subject because of you-know-who. And it's an interesting point about what kind of society we are in Europe. We didn't have this conversation ourselves. The Germans didn't start this conversation. The French didn't start this conversation. So I think it's worth being honest. We're having it precisely because the Donald wants us to have it.
And I'll tell you what's also interesting is that today, Bridget Phillipson had, I think, as a pretty blatant, deliberate talking point, a message that Donald Trump was right to lift the phone to Vladimir Putin. And the first time I said it, I sort of thought, did she really mean to say that? So I asked her again, and this is what she said.
It will require a negotiation with the Russians through part of this settlement. So I do think that is the right approach. President Trump has brought the Russians to the table. But any lasting settlement where it comes to peace does require Ukrainian voices, President Zelensky's voice, to be a central part of that.
Joe, what do you think is going on here? Because newscasters will remember when the news broke that Donald Trump had phoned Vladimir Putin, the sort of Western diplomatic world went to a huge frenzy. Oh my God, he's done that off his own back. Putin was meant to be on the edge. And now here we have our government, perhaps coincidentally a few days before the White House visit, saying actually it was right to happen.
And interestingly, the Shadow Defence Secretary said the same thing on your programme today as well. It also echoes what Keir Starmer wrote in this article in The Sun on Sunday today, talking about it being time for action. Donald Trump is right to grasp the nettle, he wrote. What was most interesting, though, about that op-ed in The Sun on Sunday, but also John Healey, the Defence Secretary's piece, in the Sunday Times was they're both trying to frame the debate on Ukraine in terms of a pretty human experience, talking about what it must be like to be going for a jog in your local community when missiles hit, talking about the lives of parents, the lives of different people in communities. I think really trying to shape public perceptions to be to try and maintain support for Ukraine amongst the British public, just as across the Atlantic, Donald Trump was at CPAC, certainly seeming to try and do something very different in changing US perceptions away from Ukraine, being critical about the amount of money, the many billions that the US has spent on that conflict, even though, as I think you pointed out on Broadcasting House, Paddy, some of those figures were a little bit questionable.
Yeah, I mean, I still think, going back to what you said, that it is extraordinary to think that the UK government position has become that it's okay to call Vladimir Putin. Is that what it? Is that what?
That's what she said. She said it twice, and I think, but given that defence and foreign affairs is not her home department, and I'm not being critical of her, I just think it was very obvious there was a deliberate decision in government to say that Donald Trump has made the right decision to bring Vladimir Putin into the diplomatic fold, and that is a move, given that the UK and the US and other countries' position, apart from Macron did have a call with Putin at the beginning of the conflict, and I can't remember the date of that, but there had been some outreach from Macron to Putin. But it is a shift for the UK to say it's the right thing to have some form of diplomatic relations with Russia by lifting the phone. Because 10 days ago, everybody was in a complete spin at the fact that he'd lifted the phone to him.
So the UK government basically supportive of the engagement, even though the position of Bridget Phillipson today and of Keir Starmer in the paper seems to still be that Ukraine must have a voice. And of course, the UK government's rather awkward difference in position is about sovereignty. Awkward in that it's different from the US position, that there should be, Keir Starmer argues, a path to NATO membership for Ukraine, even though that's been ruled out week and a half ago by...
Let's have a listen to the president.
People are being killed, mostly young men, mostly Russian and Ukrainian men, at levels you've never seen before. Thousands of people a week. And I've spoken to President Putin, and I think that thing is going to end, but it's got to end. It's a horrible, horrible thing to watch. I'm dealing with President Zelensky. I'm dealing with President Putin.
And it's interesting, today Keir Starmer said at the Scottish Labour conference, he's just said, we must have a resolution that's fair and stable for Ukraine. That's one of the great lessons of our history. The US is right that we have to do more for our defence and security in this new era. It's time to take responsibility for our security. What does that mean in terms of how big the cheque is he'll put on the Resolute desk in the White House? Well, who knows? But you can hear in that speech, as I think you were hinting at, Joe, that the government's task here is like walking along this very, 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 very narrow ledge, how to keep Trump on board, how to appeal to Donald Trump to do what the UK government would see as the right thing, without in any way diluting the UK's support for Ukraine, which has been vital and has made a difference to the conflict, has made a difference to lives in the Ukraine. But how they do that is a real tightrope. And how can Keir Starmer prevent the sort of embarrassment of that meeting going badly and having to stand next to Donald Trump at a press conference on Thursday if the meeting doesn't go his way?
We've also got to remember that even though Ukraine is, of course, this dominant issue at the moment, there are two other issues that the UK government are really focused on with Ukraine, and the diplomats that work in DC on behalf of the UK are working on. One is avoiding tariffs, something they're really, really worried about. And secondly, trying to form some sort of economic partnership in the tech space that feeds into, as avoiding tariffs would, economic growth. If that's the central focus of Keir Starmer's premiership and the only way he can really sort out many of the domestic problems, those two things will also be on the table, even if all of us are only thinking at this stage really about what's happening in Eastern Europe.
It's an interesting test for the new ambassador isn't it? Lord Mandelson, Peter Mandelson. I should be very interested to see what we see of him. Will he be side by side? Will he be in the White House? Will we see him will he be the Prince of Darkness, out of shot? Or will he be there in the main action? It's an interesting moment for me because all of our life we've followed this man's career. And it was rumoured that the president was going to block his appointment. That was a story from just a few weeks ago. I was watching his video introducing himself to Americans from the famous residence in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And he showed pictures of video of what his career had been like before. But as far as I can remember, it left out his time in the EU.
But certainly I was told that one reason he was recruited, if you're talking about being high profile, was that he is a skilled communicator and will be on Fox News in a way that, some people think this is unfair, in a way that the current UK government thought Karen Pierce wasn't as trustworthy in that space. So the intention before he was appointed was certainly that he would be someone who would be very, very, very visible. And he's been doing it for 40 years. 85 when he became Neil Kinnock's Director of Research and Communication. So he's been doing it for a long, long time.
Yeah, because I think the thing I'm interested in the two of you opining on is that there's a big split in Britain about Brexit. And we know that families are divided, political parties are divided on Brexit. However, the British are out of the EU. So Macron goes on Monday. That he's representing the EU apart from anything else. So Britain's got what Brexiteers would say is a dividend. We can say we're not those people. We have a historic alliance with the United States, and we want to be treated differently. And we don't want those horrible tariffs you're going to give to the French.
I think all of those things are true, actually. So I think, point one, it is easier in some regards for the UK to chart a different path in terms of how it approaches this diplomacy. Now we are out of the European Union. Donald Trump thought Brexit was a good idea, and he doesn't like the European Union. So tick as far as that is concerned. What I think is also true is that the UK's relationship, whether we were in the EU or not, has always been slightly different than it is with the European Union because of our history, because of all the joint military action, because of all the things that have happened between the UK and the US over a period of many, 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 many decades. So I think there was always a difference between the Britain and Brussels' relationship with America, if you like. And also that's the same when it comes to other countries in the EU. The UK and France has always had, again, when it comes to military cooperation, a different relationship with other EU countries. There are also other European countries who are not in the EU, but who are part of what you might say is this sort of loose, big security alliance that's not a formal thing. But of course, then you have the sort of big umbrella of NATO. So I'm aware that I am rambling, but Brexit has changed the calculation somewhat, but there were already differences in our relationships with America.
Well, Joe agrees.
Is that fair?
Joe's been reduced to silence.
Bored into submission?
Yeah, we should point out, as we limp through, we should point out that there's a day of the German election. So these plates shifting in the world, one of the big, mighty democracies of the world and Europe is having its election today. It's voting today. And all the issues that we talk about on Newscast, imagine if this was us worrying about these questions and it was our general election today. So we put ourselves in the position of Germany with its historic role with Russia, for goodness sake. And you can see what a giant weekend this is for the Germans, putting all of this suddenly. They go put a tick in the boxes. They get 2 votes today, as a matter of fact.
And it's one of the features as well of having a new American president is all of the different relationships with all of those different countries. And one of the interesting thing at the right-wing get-together, CPAC, that you mentioned, Joe, was seeing who else President Trump has been seeing. And we know he's now seen the Polish president, Andrzej Duda, who became the first European leader to meet him in person. He's already got a commitment from Donald Trump not to reduce the US military in Poland. So that's quite a good example of what someone said to me in government almost through gritted teeth the other day. They're like, we have to just keep reminding ourselves to pay attention to what Donald Trump does, not what he says. And a recommitment not to take any military forces or money away from Poland is not necessarily what you might have expected, given he spent the last few weeks saying Europe's got to pony up more itself.
Yeah. I mean, you had a guest who addressed this style
Yeah.
directly, because I mean, we're going to have to one day work out where newscasters are on this. Do they want every second the repetition of what the US president has said the last second?
I suspect not.
Or do they want something that will help us plot the next 4 years and what our life will be like? And we've got to get used to the style of this man and work out how to filter it. So let's have a listen to your guest. Who was it?
Zanny Minton-Beddoes, who's the editor of The Economist, and she had this take on describing this moment in time and this new style of diplomacy.
We're not in a world of traditional diplomacy. We're in a world of mobster, mafia, gangsterism. And I think it's, to sort of use TV shows, this is not The West Wing, this is The Godfather. And so everybody around the world is scratching their head thinking, how do I deal with Donald Trump? And what do you need to do? You flatter. You try to minimise any kind of disagreement. You try to turn your asks into something that brings him a win.
I mean, to hear the editor of The Economist say this is an era of mobster diplomacy really takes me by surprise. But on the other hand, it apes what Fiona Hill said, another expert in the field of national security. In his mind, the Donald has a line. One side is a winner and the other side is a loser. And what you want to do is, in a negotiation, is make him feel that he's on the side with a win. Mm-hmm. That's a useful bit of briefing from her. We also heard from Peter Ricketts on Newscast on Saturday. Mm-hmm. If you want to tell him his role in history is up for grabs here, then there's that line again. Does he want to be known as the man who helped give away a democracy in Europe to Vladimir Putin? Does he want to be known as that for the next half a century? Do you want that, the Donald, or do you want something different? I thought that was all very interesting briefing, and I hope newscasters agree, because that's not noise, that's substance.
Absolutely. And we'll see what this week brings. And it's a huge challenge and a huge risk, but also a huge potential reward for Keir Starmer if he, together with Emmanuel Macron, can make that case persuasively. And as some people might see it, slow down some of the rush towards a ceasefire deal, because Donald Trump has promised to end the war. He said time and time and time again he wants to end the war. Who would not want to end a war? The point is not about ending the war for the UK government. It's about ending the war and then securing something that looks like stability and doesn't just enable Vladimir Putin to reload and go again in a few years' time.
Here was something I found surprising in the papers today. There was a line, I think it was in the Sunday Times, saying the Foreign Secretary David Lammy may go to Washington. And I thought, shouldn't we know? Is he going or not?
I was trying to get clarity on this a few days ago from a member of his team, and they didn't reply to me, Paddy, which maybe suggests that maybe they didn't reply to you, Laura.
It's so over for Joe Pike. We're not going to reply. Well, it's because of his form, isn't it? It's because of the fact that he called him a megalomaniac and a wig.
Oh no!
I don't think that matters.
Buried the hatchet, offered him extra helpings of chicken when they all had dinner in New York. It said it's all fine.
But also, if you're worried about people who said, if you think Donald Trump is worried about people who said bad things about him, look who he has as his vice president, and also look who he has as his Secretary of State. Marco Rubio talked about the size of his hands and the size of other parts of him. So, there are definitely people who have insulted Donald Trump who have been given very senior positions.
Apparently,
I wouldn't necessarily think that writes off David Lammy.
Well, it was said to me once that actually what he loves more than anything else is somebody who was rude about him once upon a time, who now says terribly nice things and will swear fealty. Right. So that's the repenting sinner. I don't know if David Lammy is going. There might be something else that's very important and significant that he's going off to do instead. I don't know what the mystery is there. If you are David Lammy, or if you're listening, or any of his team, then text Joe back and you can put newscasters out with their misery.
And one perhaps small side point that shows quite how important this visit next week is that a senior member of the PM's team, Matthew Doyle, who's Director of Communications, has been in Washington over the last few days on a sort of pre-trip trying to sort out, I'm told, the finer details of the PM's visit. This is not some junior member of the event staff trying to work out which door people will enter, or the security team working out what the way out of this hotel or that hotel is. This is really high-level advisor in town to try and make sure things go well.
It's very interesting to do.
It's a very interesting and historic relationship. I was looking at the archive. Winston Churchill addressing the Joint Congress in 1942, referencing his American mother. Ronald Reagan on horseback with the Queen at Windsor Castle. And in 2019, Donald Trump spoke about the Normandy landing, standing next to Her late Majesty the Queen, saying what had been achieved with Americans and the Europeans together. It's a time for eloquence. I'm glad if you're telling me that the government's over there preparing for this trip, because there is a win. And, you know,
shows they're serious.
Maybe it's a bunch of old nattering journalists. We're sounding as though it's a lost cause. This is, Laura, I've said to you before, it's the politics. I've moved on from it's the economy, stupid. It's the politics.
That's because you've been spending too much time with me.
Well, there's a win for a big political figure here.
There's a huge opportunity to be had. You know, talking to people that speak about this visit have used words like historic, phenomenal. That what is potential here for the UK to grab is massive. Not just avoiding tariffs, but potentially making a genuine difference to war or lasting peace. Making a genuine difference to Keir Starmer's reputation as a Prime Minister. Could he be, after a very bumpy first 7 months in government, could he become an international figure of some standing who is able to demonstrate that he can persuade and has the ear of the most unpredictable American president, perhaps of all time, certainly of our modern times? There's so much on the table for the UK to take and do good things with if they can pull off the politics of it. Because I'm afraid, fairly or not, it is about the politics of this. And it is about the personalities too. Sometimes people get sniffy and say, well, you should keep personalities out of politics. That's not realistic. Politicians are people and they don't always behave in ways that you can predict. And therefore, appealing to people's personalities, appealing to what will be a win or a lose for them, getting into the president's head, that is the task before Keir Starmer, if he can actually pull it off.
And I'll give you another example of what I like about powerful people who actually know their time in history. And this is the standard to which I think the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and the President of France can be judged. This show us what you've got.
Yeah.
And one of the anecdotes I remember reading is about the LBJ, the president after the assassination of JFK. And he was having an argument with President de Gaulle of France, who hated the bossing, being bossed around by NATO. And de Gaulle said to LBJ, get your troops out of France. To which LBJ replied, does that include the ones buried under her soil? And that's a documented anecdote. So if Macron and Starmer want to be eloquent about the blood and treasure that's been spilled by America in the defence of Europe, this is the time we want to see it, because if the plates are shifting, we're going to learn how eloquent our Prime Minister is in relation to this history and how eloquent the French are as well. Because we know, I've already found the clip, we know that Donald Trump is very open to talking about that period of the Normandy landings. And that could be a moment I would predict that one of them will mention that in the next few days. How about I make a prediction? Because I'm always wrong. And that way that we can hold my feet to the flame.
Well, we'll see, won't we? It'll be very interesting. And maybe if some of Keir Starmer's team are listening, perhaps they might think, gosh, that's a good idea. Let's start talking about the Normandy landings, because Donald Trump, we know he's interested in the royals. We know he's interested in the concept of sort of glory and courage and bravery. He might not be always interested in the finer details of history, but I'm sure that he would recall that moment when he stood alongside the late Queen. We know how much he is interested in being associated with the monarchy. Maybe that would be something that would be wise to bring up. I don't know. So we're coming to the end of our conversations. It's about 11:15 on Sunday morning with Donald Trump. Who knows what will have happened by the end of the day.
Do keep us on the straight and narrow. Tell us how to get this judgment about how much is too much of you-know-who. Goodbye.
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 Newscast from the BBC.